I came home one rainy afternoon and found every wedding photograph of my late wife and me reduced to ashes in a rusted steel barrel behind my house. My daughter-in-law didn't flinch when she saw me staring into the smoke. She simply folded her arms and said, "They were just old papers, Thomas. The house needed less clutter." 42 years of memories disappeared in a single afternoon, while the rain quietly turned the ashes into black streaks across the concrete. I dropped to one knee without saying a word, and reached into the cooling pile with trembling hands, hoping some corner of a photograph had survived. My fingers found nothing except damp ash and tiny pieces of melted glass from frames Evelyn had polished every Christmas. Behind me, I heard the back door close, followed by my son's hesitant voice. "Dad, maybe Emily didn't mean any harm." I looked down at the ashes instead of at him because I already knew something inside our family had burned with those photographs. At that moment, I believed I had lost the last visible pieces of the woman I loved more than anyone on earth. I had no idea that the fire my daughter-in-law started would uncover a truth she could never destroy. Before I tell you how that impossible truth found its way back to me, I'd like to ask one small favor. If this story truly resonates with you, please consider staying with me until the very end. And if you feel comfortable, tell me the city or country where you're listening from, along with your local time right now. Somehow it comforts me to know that memories can travel farther than photographs ever could. My name is Thomas Whitmore. I'm 71 years old, and I have lived my entire life in Franklin, Tennessee, where people wave at strangers and remember old family names even after generations have passed. Until that rainy Thursday evening, I believed I understood what family meant. I believed love could survive grief, patience could heal distance, and respect naturally followed the years a father devoted to those he loved. I was wrong about more than one of those things. My wife Evelyn passed away 3 years earlier after a long battle with heart disease. Even now, I still catch myself setting 2 coffee mugs on quiet mornings before realizing one of them no longer belongs on the kitchen table. Some habits refuse to leave, no matter how much time passes. The wedding photographs became my way of talking to her after she was gone. Every anniversary, I opened the old leather album. Every Christmas Eve, I wiped the dust from the wooden frames. Sometimes I laughed at our terrible hairstyles from the early 80s. Sometimes I simply sat in silence and remembered the sound of her voice. Those pictures never felt like decorations. They felt like conversations that death hadn't managed to steal. Emily never understood that, or maybe she never wanted to. At first, her comments sounded harmless. "You should modernize this place. Nobody keeps photo albums anymore. Everything's digital now." I usually smiled and changed the subject because arguing over family photographs seemed foolish. Evelyn always believed peace inside a home was worth protecting whenever possible. I tried to honor that belief, even after she was gone. Over the past year, though, little things quietly disappeared from the house. An old rocking chair Evelyn loved was donated without asking me. Boxes from the attic were thrown away because they looked outdated. One afternoon, I spent nearly an hour searching for the ceramic cookie jar my wife painted by hand, before Emily casually admitted she'd given it to a thrift store. "It's just stuff," she said. Those 3 words became something I heard more often than I wanted. Just stuff. Just old furniture. Just dusty boxes. Just another memory that apparently no longer deserved a place inside my own home. Daniel rarely argued with her. He usually rubbed the back of his neck, sighed softly, and said, "Let's not make this into something bigger than it is." Maybe he truly believed he was keeping the peace. Maybe he simply grew tired of choosing. Standing beside that steel barrel while the rain soaked through my jacket, I heard Emily speak again. "You'll feel better once the house is cleaned up." I looked at her for a long moment. There wasn't anger in her face. There wasn't guilt either. What frightened me most was how ordinary she looked, as though destroying someone else's lifetime of memories belonged on the same list as vacuuming the living room or taking out the trash. I wanted to yell. I wanted to ask who had given her the right to erase 42 years. Instead, I bent down, scooped another handful of wet ashes into an empty cookie tin I found on the porch, and quietly closed the lid. Daniel watched me without saying anything. The silence between us weighed more than the rain. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I placed the tin beside Evelyn's wedding ring on my nightstand. I remember staring at it until nearly 2 in the morning, wondering whether memories could truly disappear once every photograph was gone. Then, just before I turned off the lamp, my phone vibrated with a voicemail from a number I had never seen before. The man's voice was old, calm, and strangely familiar. "Mr. Whitmore, my name is Arthur Bennett. I believe I still have something that belongs to you and your wife. Please call me when you're ready. It's about your wedding photographs." I did not return Arthur Bennett's call that night. I simply sat in the darkness, listening to the steady rhythm of rain tapping against the bedroom window, wondering whether an old stranger had dialed the wrong number. My hand rested on the small cookie tin filled with ashes, and beside it lay Evelyn's wedding ring, exactly where she had left it the night before. She was admitted to the hospital 3 years earlier. Some people say grief becomes easier with time. I have never believed that. It does not become lighter. It simply learns how to sit quietly beside you until you almost forget it is there. Then something as small as an empty chair or an old song reminds you it never really left. Evelyn used to laugh whenever I insisted on taking photographs. "Tom," she would tease, "if you keep stopping every 5 minutes for another picture, we will never get anywhere." I always answered the same way. "One day we will be glad we saved today." Back then, we were young enough to think there would always be another tomorrow. We built our life the slow way. We bought a modest house instead of chasing a larger one. We drove used cars until they could barely make it through another winter. We skipped vacations whenever Daniel needed braces or school supplies. Every decision felt ordinary at the time, but looking back, those ordinary choices became the foundation of everything we called family. I remember the afternoon Daniel was 8 years old and accidentally knocked over a framed photograph from our honeymoon. The glass shattered across the hardwood floor, and his little face turned pale. "Dad, I am sorry." His voice shook so badly that Evelyn immediately knelt beside him and smiled. "Nobody is hurt," she said softly. "Pictures can be repaired. Hearts are harder to fix." We spent the rest of the evening replacing the broken glass together. Daniel carefully wiped the frame while I cut a new backing board from an old cardboard box in the garage. Before bed, Evelyn placed the repaired photograph back on the bookshelf and whispered to Daniel, "Always remember something, sweetheart." Respecting memories is another way of loving the people who made them. I often replay that evening in my mind because I cannot understand where those lessons disappeared. Somewhere between adulthood, promotions, mortgage payments, and raising his own family, my son slowly stopped seeing memories the way his mother did. It did not happen all at once. It never does. At first, he simply became busy. Sunday dinners turned into once-a-month visits. Birthdays became quick phone calls between meetings. Holidays felt rushed because somebody always had another place to be. "We will stay longer next time," Daniel would promise while putting on his coat. There was always another next time until one day there was not. After Evelyn passed away, silence settled over the house like fresh snow. Friends came often during the first few weeks. Neighbors brought casseroles. Church members stopped by with flowers. Then life moved forward for everyone except me. Daniel encouraged me to let him and Emily move into the house after their apartment lease ended. "You should not be alone, Dad," he said. "We can all help each other." I wanted to believe him because loneliness has a way of making even cautious people hopeful. For a while, everything seemed pleasant enough. Emily thanked me for making breakfast. Daniel mowed the lawn on weekends. We watched baseball together in the evenings, just like we had years earlier. I remember thinking Evelyn would have been happy to see laughter return to the living room. Then little changes began appearing almost too quietly to notice. Family portraits disappeared from shelves because they looked crowded. My favorite armchair was moved into the basement to create what Emily called a cleaner design. The quilt Evelyn had sewn by hand no longer rested across the couch because it did not match the new colors. None of those decisions seemed important by themselves. Every time I questioned one of them, Emily smiled politely. "It is only decorating, Thomas." Daniel usually nodded. "She has a good eye, Dad." Maybe she did. But every improvement somehow required removing another piece of Evelyn from the house she had spent 4 decades turning into a home. One evening, I found myself standing in the hallway, staring at a blank section of wall where a family portrait had hung for nearly 20 years. "Where is the picture?" I asked. Emily looked up from her tablet without much concern. "Storage. Why?" "Nobody really looks at those anymore." I almost answered, but Daniel spoke first. Dad, it is just a wall. I smiled because arguing would not have brought the portrait back. Yet something inside me quietly whispered that if enough walls became empty, eventually the entire story of our family would disappear with them. I did not realize then how close that quiet fear was to becoming reality, or that somewhere only 30 miles away, an elderly photographer was holding something that neither time nor fire had been able to erase. The next morning I woke before sunrise, but instead of making coffee right away, I found myself standing in the hallway again. My eyes settled on the empty spaces where photographs had once lived. The walls looked freshly painted, clean, almost elegant by modern standards. Yet every empty nail hole felt like a sentence that had been erased from the story of my life. I reached out and touched one of those tiny holes with my fingertip. It was strange how something so small could feel so permanent. Downstairs, I heard cabinet doors closing. Emily was already awake. By the time I entered the kitchen, she was arranging fresh flowers on the island countertop while a home improvement show played quietly on the television. She smiled without looking at me. "Morning, Thomas." "Morning." She glanced toward the hallway. "Does it not feel brighter now?" I followed her eyes. "It feels quieter." She laughed softly. "Minimalism is peaceful. You would get used to it." I poured myself a cup of coffee and stared out the window. The oak tree Evelyn and I planted 30 years earlier was beginning to lose its leaves. Every season seemed to carry away another piece of the life we had built together. Daniel walked in a few minutes later, still buttoning his work shirt. "Morning, Dad." "Morning." Emily placed a folder on the counter. "Before you disappear to work, I want to go over something." Daniel looked at her. "Now, it will only take a minute." She opened the folder and spread several pages across the granite countertop. Floor plans, furniture catalogs, estimates from contractors. I quietly sipped my coffee while they talked. "The guest room should become my office," Emily said. "The dining room could be opened into the kitchen." Daniel nodded slowly. "That might make the place feel larger." Then she pointed toward another page. "And eventually we should renovate the master bedroom too." Daniel hesitated. "That is still Dad's room," Emily shrugged. "For now." The words landed harder than either of them seemed to realize. I finally asked, "What exactly are you planning?" Emily answered with complete confidence. "We are thinking long-term." "Long-term? This house will stay in the family eventually. We should start making it practical instead of keeping it frozen in time." I looked at Daniel, expecting him to say something. Instead, he rubbed his forehead and quietly replied, "She is only trying to plan ahead. Plan ahead." I had spent 42 years planning ahead with Evelyn. We had planned college tuition, retirement savings, hospital visits, birthdays, anniversaries, and finally funeral arrangements neither of us wanted to discuss. Yet somehow, my own future inside my own house was now being discussed as though I were not standing there. I folded the contractor drawings and gently pushed them back across the counter. "As long as I am alive," I said calmly. "This home is not a project." Emily crossed her arms. "Thomas, you cannot preserve every memory forever." "No," I answered, "but I can decide which ones deserve to stay." For the first time since she had moved into the house, the polite smile disappeared from her face. That is exactly the problem. The kitchen became painfully quiet. Daniel looked from her to me, clearly wishing the conversation would end. Emily picked up one of the folders again. "Every room is filled with things connected to Evelyn. Every conversation comes back to Evelyn. Every holiday is about Evelyn. You expect everyone else to keep living inside your memories." I swallowed before answering. "This was her home. It is our home now." Her voice remained calm, but every word carried more weight than the last. "Families move forward." I nodded slowly. "Families also remember where they came from." Daniel finally stepped between us. "Can we please stop?" Emily sighed and gathered the papers. "Fine. But this conversation is not over." She walked upstairs without another word. Daniel remained in the kitchen, staring at the countertop. "She does not mean to hurt you." I smiled sadly. "Maybe not." He looked relieved. "Good. Intentions matter," I continued quietly. "But choices matter too." He opened his mouth as if he wanted to answer, then simply grabbed his keys and left for work. The front door closed, and once again the house belonged to silence. That afternoon, I decided to clean the old cedar chest Evelyn had kept at the foot of our bed. Most of the blankets were still there, folded exactly as she had left them. Beneath them rested a small envelope addressed in her handwriting. My heart skipped for a moment until I realized it was empty. Whatever had once been inside was gone. I searched the entire chest again, then the closet shelves, then the dresser drawers. Nothing. The envelope had clearly held something important years ago, because Evelyn had written only 3 words across the front. For Arthur Bennett. I stared at the handwriting for a long time, feeling a strange chill despite the warm afternoon sunlight filling the room. Arthur had just left me a voicemail less than 12 hours earlier. I had never heard Evelyn mention his name after our wedding. Yet somehow, decades before she died, she had prepared an envelope meant for the very man who had suddenly reached out to me. At that moment, I realized his phone call was not a coincidence. It was the beginning of something Evelyn had quietly set in motion long before any of us knew we would need it. For several minutes, I sat on the edge of the cedar chest with Evelyn's empty envelope resting in my hands. Her handwriting had never changed over the years. Every birthday card, every grocery list, every note she tucked into my lunchbox when we were younger carried the same graceful curves. Seeing the words "for Arthur Bennett" felt less like discovering an old envelope and more like hearing her whisper my name from another room. I finally picked up my phone and returned the voicemail. The line rang only once. "Thomas?" the elderly voice answered. "Yes." There was a brief pause, followed by a quiet sigh that carried more relief than surprise. "I have been hoping you would call. You said you had something that belonged to Evelyn and me." "I do. But I would rather show you than explain it over the telephone." His voice remained steady, patient, almost comforting. "Would you be willing to drive to Nashville tomorrow?" I looked toward the bedroom window. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the backyard washed clean except for the dark stain where the steel barrel had stood. "I can be there." "Good," Arthur replied. "I think your wife expected this day to come, even if neither of us wanted it to." The call ended before I could ask another question. I barely slept that night. Every possibility seemed equally impossible. By sunrise, I was already on Interstate 65, driving north through rolling Tennessee hills covered with early autumn color. The farther I drove from home, the more I wondered why Evelyn had trusted a photographer with something she had never mentioned to me. Arthur's studio occupied the corner of an old brick building just outside downtown Nashville. The painted sign above the door had faded after decades beneath the southern sun, but the words "Bennett Portrait Studio" were still visible. A small brass bell rang when I stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of old wood, photochemicals, and paper that had been carefully preserved for generations. Shelves lined every wall, filled with labeled archive boxes stacked with remarkable precision. Behind an antique oak counter stood a slender man with silver hair wearing a pressed blue sweater despite the warm afternoon. He smiled the moment he saw me. "Thomas Whitmore." He walked around the counter and extended both hands instead of one. "It is good to finally see you again." I frowned gently. "Again?" His eyes softened. "You probably do not remember me. 42 years changes a face." He chuckled quietly. "But I remember both of you very well." Before I could respond, another customer waiting near the front display looked toward us. An older woman studying framed family portraits smiled. Arthur never forgets a couple after photographing their wedding. Arthur laughed. "Only the memorable ones." He turned back toward me. "You and Evelyn were impossible to forget." He led me toward a back room where sunlight filtered through tall windows onto long wooden tables covered with archival sleeves and white cotton gloves. Everything about the place reflected respect for memory. Nothing appeared rushed. Nothing felt disposable. Arthur noticed me looking around. "People think photographs are paper," he said. "They are not. They are witnesses." I quietly repeated his words. "Witnesses." He nodded. "They tell the truth long after voices disappear." We sat across from one another, and for several moments neither of us spoke. Finally, I reached into my jacket and carefully placed Evelyn's empty envelope on the table. Arthur looked down at it, and all color slowly left his face. He removed his glasses and closed his eyes for a moment before speaking. "I have not seen that envelope in more than 4 decades. It was hidden inside Evelyn's cedar chest." He gently touched the handwriting with one finger but did not open it. She asked me never to mention this unless something happened to your photographs. My heart began beating harder. She knew? He looked directly at me. She did not predict what happened. She simply believed memories were fragile. Arthur stood without another word and walked toward a tall steel cabinet at the far end of the archive room. He unlocked 3 separate locks before sliding open the heavy door. Inside were hundreds of carefully numbered gray storage boxes. He moved slowly down one shelf until his hand stopped on a single case. He lifted it with remarkable care, almost as though he were carrying something alive. The faded label read only one word in black ink: Whitmore. Arthur returned to the table but did not open the box immediately. Instead, he looked into my eyes with an expression somewhere between sorrow and admiration. "Thomas," he said quietly, "before you see what is inside, there is something about your wife that even your own family never knew. She asked me to protect a promise, and after 42 years, I believe it is finally time to keep it." Arthur rested both hands on the gray archive box for several seconds before lifting the lid. He did not rush the moment, neither did I. It felt as though we were standing at the doorway of 42 years, waiting for someone to quietly invite us inside. The first thing I saw was not a photograph but a row of carefully sleeved 35mm negatives, each one labeled in Evelyn's unmistakable handwriting. My breath caught. "She wrote these?" I asked. Arthur nodded. "Every roll after your ceremony." He gently slid one sleeve onto a light table and switched on a soft white lamp beneath it. Tiny frames suddenly glowed like windows into another lifetime. I recognized the church steps, the old maple tree beside the parking lot, Evelyn laughing while the wind caught her veil. Images I had never seen before stretched across the strip of film. Arthur smiled. "Most couples only ordered the finished prints. Your wife asked me to preserve everything. Every frame, every mistake, every laugh between poses." He opened another archival folder filled with contact sheets. There were dozens of photographs that had never been enlarged. In one, Evelyn was looking directly at me while I was distracted by Daniel's grandfather adjusting his tie. In another, she was wiping away tears after her father embraced her outside the church. I reached toward the paper but stopped before touching it. "I never knew these existed." "Almost nobody did," Arthur replied. She believed the quiet moments mattered more than the perfect ones. His words sounded exactly like something Evelyn would have said herself. We continued turning pages together. The room remained almost silent, except for the faint rustle of archival paper. Every few photographs, Arthur shared a memory. "Your wife insisted the flower girl be included in the family portraits because she was nervous. She asked me to photograph your parents before anyone else, because she knew they disliked standing in crowds. She noticed when one of my assistants looked exhausted and quietly brought him coffee. I smiled through eyes that had begun to sting. That sounds like Evelyn." Arthur looked at me thoughtfully. "She noticed everyone." Then he pulled a thinner envelope from beneath the contact sheets. Unlike the others, it carried no date. Only a handwritten note that read, "Open only with Thomas present." Arthur looked at me before carefully breaking the old seal. Inside was a folded letter and a bank receipt that had yellowed with age. I frowned. A bank receipt? Arthur slid it across the table. It showed a modest payment made just 3 weeks after our wedding. The amount itself meant little now, but the description caught my attention. Archival Preservation Trust. I looked back at Arthur. "She paid for this?" "Every dollar herself," he answered. "You had just bought your first house. Money was tight. She did not want you worrying about one more expense." I stared at the faded receipt, remembering how often Evelyn quietly solved problems before I even realized they existed. She never mentioned it. Arthur smiled gently. That was the point. He unfolded the letter but did not hand it to me yet. "Before you read this, there is something else you deserve to know." He walked toward another cabinet and returned carrying a leather appointment book from the early 1980s. Its pages were worn from decades of use. He opened it to our wedding week. There, written in neat blue ink beside our names, was another appointment scheduled for the following morning. "I do not remember coming back," I admitted. Arthur nodded. "Because you did not." He turned the book toward me. Beneath your names was a second entry. Evelyn Whitmore. Private session. I looked at him in confusion. She came back alone, very early, before you were awake. Arthur sat down again, his expression growing more serious. She asked me to photograph a few things she wanted preserved separately. Not because they were valuable, but because she believed they would someday explain who the two of you really were. He finally handed me the letter. My hands trembled as I unfolded the first page. The familiar handwriting instantly brought tears to my eyes. Dear Arthur, if Thomas is reading this beside you, then something precious has already been lost. Please remind him that our life was never contained inside frames or albums. The photographs only point toward the truth. The truth is somewhere else entirely. I stopped reading and looked up. What does she mean? Arthur took a slow breath. Keep going. I lowered my eyes to the next paragraph. It took before I could continue. A small photograph slipped from between the pages and landed face up on the table. It was not from our wedding day. It showed Evelyn standing beside a locked wooden cabinet inside this very studio, holding a small metal key in her hand and smiling directly at the camera. Written across the bottom in her handwriting were 6 words that instantly changed everything. Thomas must open this himself, someday. For a long moment, neither Arthur nor I reached for the small metal key in the photograph. It rested there like a quiet promise that had waited more than 4 decades for someone to notice it. I finished reading the rest of Evelyn's letter before speaking again. Her words were simple, just as she had always been. She wrote that love was never measured by what people displayed, but by what they chose to protect when nobody was watching. She thanked Arthur for agreeing to guard something she hoped I would never need. At the very end, she added one sentence that stayed with me long after I folded the letter. If this day ever comes, do not be angry. Simply let the truth do its work. I looked across the table. She trusted you with all of this. Arthur nodded quietly. She trusted both of us. He stood and walked toward the old wooden cabinet from the photograph. Time had darkened the oak, but I recognized the carved edges from the picture that had slipped from Evelyn's letter. Arthur placed his hand against the cabinet door without opening it. She asked me to leave everything exactly where she put it, unless you came here yourself. He stepped aside. This belongs to you now. I took the small key from the envelope. Even after all these years, the brass still carried a faint shine where countless fingers had once held it. My hand trembled as I slipped it into the lock. The mechanism turned with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than anything else in the room. Inside were 3 carefully wrapped packages, a leather journal, and a flat archival box sealed with wax. There were no valuables, no stacks of money, no dramatic surprises. Instead, everything inside reflected the woman I had loved. Orderly, thoughtful, patient. Arthur gently lifted the journal first. I have never opened it. I looked at him. Not once? He smiled. A promise only means something if it costs you the chance to satisfy your own curiosity. His answer reminded me why Evelyn had trusted him. I opened the journal to the first page. It was not a diary. It was a record. Every few pages contained notes about family milestones, anniversaries, births, and holidays, each one paired with references to photograph numbers stored in Arthur's archive. Evelyn had created her own map of our family's history, connecting memories to moments with remarkable care. She indexed everything, I whispered. Arthur laughed softly. She told me that memories become easier to lose as families grow. She wanted future generations to know where they came from. I slowly turned another page. There were handwritten notes beside Daniel's first day of school, my parents' 50th anniversary, and the summer we rebuilt our front porch together. Each memory was attached to negatives that still existed safely inside this building. Then I stopped. One page carried a heading written several years after our wedding, Family Legacy. Underneath it, Evelyn had written, "Never let anyone believe this home was built by one person. Every sacrifice deserves to be remembered." Attached to the page was a folded document. Arthur recognized it immediately. I wondered if she had placed that here. I unfolded it carefully. It was a copy of the original closing statement for our house in Franklin. Both of our names appeared on every page. Handwritten notes in the margins showed how we had divided every monthly payment during the difficult early years. There was nothing extraordinary about the paperwork itself. What mattered was what it represented. The home had never been simply inherited or handed to us. It had been built through decades of shared effort, overtime shifts, skipped vacations, and careful budgeting. Evelyn had wanted that story preserved alongside the photographs. Arthur looked at me thoughtfully. "Do you remember what Emily called the photographs?" I nodded slowly. "Old papers." He gently tapped the closing statement. "Sometimes old papers tell the most important stories." I could not help smiling for the first time since the fire. It was a small smile, but it felt genuine. My phone suddenly vibrated across the table. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I answered. "Hello." His voice sounded uneasy. "Dad, where are you?" "Nashville." There was a long pause. "Emily found out you drove there." I remained calm. "All right." He hesitated before continuing. "She thinks you are trying to prove something against her." I glanced toward Arthur, who quietly resumed organizing the photographs without interrupting. "I am not trying to prove anything," I answered. "I am only learning the truth." Daniel lowered his voice. "She wants you to come home tonight. She says this has gone far enough." Before I could respond, another voice rose in the background. Emily was speaking loudly enough for me to hear through the phone. "Ask him if he found anything besides more old pictures." I looked down at the journal resting open before me. "Tell Emily I found much more than photographs." Silence filled the line. Finally, Daniel asked, "What do you mean?" I closed the journal carefully and looked toward the final sealed archival box that still remained untouched inside the cabinet. Arthur followed my eyes and spoke almost in a whisper. "Thomas, everything you have seen today explains your past. What is inside that last box explains why Evelyn believed your family would one day need the truth more than the memories themselves." Arthur waited until I ended the call before reaching for the final archival box. He did not hand it to me immediately. Instead, he rested his palm lightly on the lid, almost the way a pastor might pause before reading a difficult passage. "Your wife believed timing mattered," he said quietly. "Some truths become meaningful only after people have shown you who they really are." I nodded. "I think I understand that now." He smiled with a sadness that only comes from living long enough to watch families change. "I wish you did not have to." The wax seal broke with a gentle crack. Inside was another collection of carefully preserved negatives, several large photographic prints wrapped in tissue paper, and a legal-size envelope addressed in Evelyn's handwriting. This one carried different words. "To be shared when remembrance is questioned." Arthur looked at me. She chose every word carefully. I opened the envelope and found copies of letters, receipts, and a handwritten list describing where every important family photograph had been taken, who was present, and why she believed each moment deserved to be remembered. She had written small reflections beside many of them. Daniel's first fishing trip. The afternoon we finished paying off our mortgage. The Christmas my father finally smiled after losing my mother. Reading those pages felt less like studying documents, and more like hearing Evelyn gently explain our life one memory at a time. Then another photograph caught my attention. It showed Evelyn and me standing outside our house shortly after we bought it. We were holding paint rollers, both covered in white paint, laughing so hard neither of us looked at the camera. Arthur noticed my expression. "That picture was never ordered." "Why?" I asked. He smiled. "Your wife said it was too ordinary." He paused before adding, "I always disagreed." We spent another hour reviewing photographs that had never left the archive. None of them revealed hidden wealth or secret power. Instead, they revealed something much harder to erase. They proved that every meaningful part of our family had been built through patience, sacrifice, and quiet acts of love that rarely attracted attention. As I prepared to leave, Arthur placed several archival sleeves into a protective case. "Take these home." "What about the originals?" "The originals stay here where they are safe." He looked directly at me. "Copies can comfort people. Originals protect the truth." During the drive back to Franklin, I replayed his words again and again. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the Tennessee hills, and for the first time since the fire, I no longer felt as though I had lost everything. I had lost paper. I had not lost our story. When I pulled into the driveway, Daniel was already waiting on the front porch. He walked toward my truck before I even turned off the engine. "Dad." His voice carried exhaustion more than anger. "Can we talk?" I stepped out, holding the protective case close against my side. Of course. He looked at the case. Is that what you found? Some of it. He rubbed his forehead. Emily has been upset all day. Before I could answer, the front door opened. Emily stepped outside with her arms folded. So this is what everyone has been chasing. Her eyes settled on the case in my hands. More photographs? I answered calmly. More memories. She shook her head. Thomas, you are turning this into something it was never meant to be. I did not raise my voice. What do you think it was meant to be? She hesitated, cleaning out old things. Without asking me, she looked away for only a moment. I thought I was helping. Daniel quietly spoke before I could respond. Emily, did you ask Dad before throwing anything away? She sighed impatiently. We have already talked about this. No, he replied. We have avoided talking about it. The difference surprised even me. For the first time, Daniel was not trying to smooth everything over. He was asking a direct question. Emily noticed it too. You are taking his side now? I am trying to understand what happened. You already know what happened. Daniel slowly shook his head. I thought I did. The silence between them felt different from every earlier argument. It was no longer father against daughter-in-law. It had become two people struggling to explain choices that suddenly looked very different under the light of new facts. I quietly walked inside and placed the protective case on the dining room table. Neither of them followed immediately. Through the front window, I could still hear fragments of their conversation. You said they were just decorations. I believe they were. Did you ever ask why they mattered to him? Their voices grew softer until I could no longer distinguish the words. A few minutes later, Daniel entered the house alone. He looked at the photographs visible through the archival sleeves and slowly sat down across from me. Dad, he said carefully, I think I owe you an apology. Before I could answer, the front door opened again. Emily walked in holding a small cardboard box I had never seen before. Her expression had changed. She no longer looked defensive. She looked unsettled. She placed the box on the table beside the photographs without saying a word. I found this in the attic after you left, she whispered. I almost threw it away too. I looked down at the faded label on the lid. Written in Evelyn's familiar handwriting were 5 simple words that made the entire room fall silent. Open together, not alone. None of us reached for the box right away. It sat in the middle of the dining room table beneath the warm light Evelyn had chosen years earlier, because she always said family conversations deserved soft lighting. Daniel looked from the faded handwriting on the lid to me, then to Emily. Mom wrote this? He asked quietly. I nodded. It looks like it. Emily swallowed. I found it behind an old suitcase in the attic. I almost put it with everything else. She stopped speaking before finishing the sentence. She did not need to. We all knew what she meant. I carefully lifted the lid. Inside were several sealed envelopes, a folded tablecloth embroidered with our wedding date, and a small cassette recorder beside a neatly labeled tape. There was also one handwritten note resting on top. It simply read, If we are opening this together, then our family needs to remember something more important than photographs. Daniel slowly sat down. Emily remained standing, almost as though she did not believe she deserved a chair anymore. I unfolded the note while the room fell completely silent. Evelyn's handwriting seemed to carry her gentle voice into the room once again. She wrote that families rarely fall apart because of one terrible day. They drift apart one small decision at a time. One ignored conversation, one forgotten apology, one memory dismissed as unimportant. She asked that whoever opened the box promise never to measure another person's life by how useful their belongings appeared. When I finished reading, nobody spoke for several seconds. Daniel finally broke the silence. She was trying to protect us. Yes, I answered. Even from ourselves. Emily lowered her eyes. I never knew she wrote things like this. Because she never wrote them for herself, I replied. She wrote them for the people she hoped would need them one day. Daniel reached for another envelope. Inside was a collection of handwritten recipes Evelyn had copied from both her mother and mine. Each recipe included small notes describing birthdays, family dinners, and holidays when those meals had been served. They were not simply instructions for cooking. They were pieces of family history. Emily gently touched one of the pages before quickly pulling her hand back. I threw away her recipe box last winter, she whispered. Her voice cracked for the first time since all of this began. I thought these were duplicates. Daniel slowly looked at her. He did not sound angry. Somehow that made his words even heavier. You never asked. Emily closed her eyes. I know. Another envelope contained letters Evelyn had written to Daniel over the years but never given to him. One was meant for the day he became a father. Another was written after our 25th wedding anniversary. She explained that she had decided not to give them to him because she wanted him to discover certain lessons through life rather than through advice. Daniel quietly wiped his eyes. I thought she never wrote me anything. She did, I said softly. She simply trusted time. Emily stepped back from the table as though every new discovery made it harder for her to remain in the room. I kept telling everyone they were just old things. Nobody answered immediately because there was nothing left to argue about. The truth no longer needed anyone to defend it. It stood on its own. During the following week, something changed without anyone announcing it. Daniel stopped making excuses. He personally rehung every remaining family photograph we had been able to reproduce from Arthur's archive. He asked where each one belonged instead of deciding for me. Sometimes he would stop in front of a picture and quietly ask, "Tell me what happened that day." For the first time in years, he wanted the stories instead of simply passing by them. Emily changed in quieter ways. One afternoon, I found her carefully cleaning the empty wooden frames that had survived the fire. She looked embarrassed when she noticed me standing in the doorway. "I know the originals are gone," she said, "but maybe these still deserve to stay." I smiled gently. "Thank you." She lowered the cloth. I spent so much time trying to make this house look newer that I forgot to ask why it looked the way it did. I nodded. Homes are built twice, once with lumber, then with memories. She stood silently for a moment before saying the words I never expected to hear. "Thomas, I am sorry. Not because people know what I did, because I finally understand what I destroyed." There was no dramatic forgiveness, no raised voices, no speeches. Some wounds deserve quiet more than words. I simply answered, "Understanding is where healing begins." News of the restored photographs slowly spread among relatives who had believed every image from our wedding had vanished forever. Arthur sent beautifully printed copies along with a note reminding us that preserving memories was a responsibility shared by every generation. No one blamed him. Everyone thanked him. The respect Emily had once taken for granted changed as well. Family members who had admired her confidence now questioned her judgment. Invitations became less frequent. Conversations became more careful. She was not rejected because anyone sought revenge against her. Trust had simply become something she would have to earn again, one choice at a time. Watching all of this unfold, I realized that justice had arrived without anger. No courtroom, no shouting, no victory to celebrate. Only the quiet consequences of decisions meeting the quiet strength of truth. A few days later, Arthur called once more. His voice sounded warm. "Thomas, there is one last package ready for you." I smiled. I thought we had opened everything. He chuckled softly. "Not everything belongs to the past. Some memories were waiting for the right future." As I looked around the living room where familiar photographs had begun returning to their places, I felt, for the first time in a very long while, that Evelyn's story was no longer about what had been lost. It was about what still had the power to bring a family home. Arthur asked me to meet him one last time on a quiet Saturday morning. The autumn air carried the familiar scent of fallen leaves as I drove back to Nashville. But this journey felt very different from the one before. I was no longer searching for something that had been lost. I was simply walking towards something that had patiently waited for me. When I arrived, Arthur greeted me with the same gentle smile he had worn every time I had seen him. He placed a small wooden box on the counter between us. It was no larger than a family Bible, polished smooth by careful hands. "This was always meant to be yours," he said. I slowly opened the lid. Inside rested the brass key from Evelyn's photograph, now attached to a silver chain, beside a beautifully restored leather album, containing every wedding photograph, every candid image, every contact sheet, and every handwritten note she had preserved. Tucked into the final page was one last letter. I unfolded it carefully. My dearest Thomas, if you are holding this album, then life has reminded you that nothing made by human hands lasts forever. Photographs fade, houses grow old. Even the strongest hearts eventually grow tired. But love is never carried by paper alone. It lives in the people who choose kindness after disappointment, dignity after disrespect, and hope after heartbreak. If our family ever forgets that, remind them gently, never with anger, never with pride, simply by the way you continue living. I lowered the letter without realizing tears had begun running down my face. Arthur quietly placed one hand on my shoulder. She knew exactly who she married. I smiled through the tears. No, she simply believed I could become that man when I needed to. Before leaving, Arthur locked the archive room once more. These originals will remain here for as long as this building stands, he said. One generation protects them for the next. I thanked him, but somehow the words felt too small for everything he had guarded on our behalf. Back home, life did not suddenly become perfect. Healing rarely arrives all at once. Instead, it appeared in ordinary moments. Daniel started coming by every Sunday morning without anyone reminding him. Sometimes we worked together in the yard. Sometimes we simply drank coffee on the back porch while watching the sunrise. More than once, he quietly asked, "Dad, tell me another story about Mom." I always did. Emily changed as well, although not because anyone demanded it. She volunteered to organize every restored photograph into new archival sleeves. She framed copies of the recovered wedding portraits and hung them exactly where they had belonged. One evening, she walked into the living room carrying the small cookie tin that had once held nothing but ashes. She placed it gently in front of me. "I think this belongs with the album now," she said. I opened the tin and looked at the dark gray ashes resting inside. For a long moment, I simply stared at them. Then I closed the lid again and smiled. "No," I answered softly. "These belong somewhere else." A few days later, Daniel helped me build a simple cedar memory bench beneath the old oak tree that Evelyn and I had planted 3 decades earlier. Together, we mixed the ashes into the soil around a young white dogwood tree growing beside the bench. Emily stood quietly nearby, holding one of the restored wedding photographs, while autumn sunlight filtered through the branches above us. Nobody spoke for several minutes. Words were unnecessary. Some endings deserve silence, because silence allows gratitude to be heard. As winter slowly gave way to spring, grandchildren gathered beneath that same tree, laughing while chasing one another across the yard. The restored photographs filled the walls once again, but I noticed something surprising. I no longer looked at them every day. I did not need to. The memories had found their way back into the life we were living instead of remaining trapped inside frames. One afternoon, Daniel asked, "Dad, do you think Mom would forgive us?" I looked toward the dogwood tree swaying gently in the breeze. "Your mother believed forgiveness was something we practiced before people deserved it, not after." Emily quietly wiped away a tear. "I will spend the rest of my life earning back the trust I damaged." I reached across the table and gently covered her hand with mine. Trust grows the same way trees do, slowly. But if you care for it every day, one morning you wake up sitting in its shade. That evening, I placed Evelyn's final letter back inside the restored album, slipped the brass key onto the silver chain, and hung it beside our wedding portrait in the hallway. It no longer represented a secret waiting to be discovered. It had become a reminder that the strongest things we leave behind are not possessions, but the values we choose to protect. Looking back now, I realize my greatest loss was never those burned photographs. My greatest danger was believing that someone else's cruelty could erase a lifetime of love. It never could. If you have ever been made to feel invisible inside your own family, I hope you remember this. Your worth is not determined by how others treat your memories. Healthy boundaries are not acts of rejection. They are acts of self-respect. Hold on to your independence. Treasure the people who honor your story. And never allow anyone to convince you that your life's memories are nothing more than old papers. If this journey touched your heart, I would truly appreciate it if you would like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who may need this reminder today. The simplest lesson I carry forward is this: what is built with love can be damaged, but it can never truly be erased. Thank you for walking beside me through every step of this story. I wish you peace in your own home, courage in every difficult season, and hope that grows stronger with each new day. Until we meet again in another story, take good care of yourself and of the memories that remind you who you are.